CDs are back, and I was wrong about the reasons why they're back. Maybe you were too. You remember these things? That's right, compact discs. We didn't just buy them growing up, we earned them. Delivering newspapers, mowing lawns, borrowing money from your mom's pocketbook, hoping that she wouldn't notice. Today, the mainstream doesn't think that these compact discs matter anymore, that they're dead, obsolete, a shiny relic from a mall-based civilization. However, they are wrong, because today we're going to talk about the rise, the fall, and the unlikely rise again of compact discs. We're going to talk about the crazy history, including a company that did all sorts of shenanigans, and then an unlikely savior. So sit down, grab a cup of coffee, and let's talk about the rise, the fall, and the rise again of the compact disc. Sony did not just participate with compact discs, they helped create them. Sony and Philips co-created the compact disc in the late 1970s, and they released it publicly in 1982. They literally created the standards. They literally created the players. They literally got paid on every compact disc and every compact disc player released. It was a license to print money. They made billions, and it was almost the perfect vertical integration. In the 1990s, Sony was the literal final boss when it came to consumer electronics. Started with the Walkman, then the Discman, CD changers the size of air fryers, and a record label empire. They controlled music culture. But that is where the cracks started to show up. Because when you control everything, you also want to control the price. And that is when Sony got caught doing something very 90s. Price fixing.
What can we say about Sony? What can we say about the Japanese? Let's start now.
In the mid-1990s, Sony was profitable, suspiciously profitable when it came to CDs. If you're my age and you remember correctly, they were selling for $15, $18, even $20. And some people started to notice because in the year 2000, a bunch of different states started suing Sony and some other music labels. They were accused of price fixing through the minimum advertised pricing, or MAP pricing, which means retailers weren't allowed to advertise compact discs below a certain price point. Now, technically, they could sell them below a certain price point. However, when Sony and some of the other CD cartels figured that out, well, they cut off stuff, marketing, and in some cases, they lost the rights to sell those CDs altogether. So technically, a retailer could do whatever they wanted, but if they did whatever they wanted, they might not have any more CDs to sell. And the outcome? Well, Sony never admitted any guilt, neither did the other record labels, but they did have to shell out $143 million. Thing to remember, though, is it was estimated that we, the public, got overcharged about $800 million, which in the end didn't really matter because they still made money, even though they had to pay fines. But even when the public was screaming about CD prices, Sony went and did something even weirder. They tried to replace the very format that they helped create with something that they had even more control over. Enter the MiniDisc, a format that nobody really asked for. But for Sony, it would do something that, well, they didn't have with Philips, and that was complete control. Control over the format, control over the blank discs, control over the players themselves, and control over the software that the players needed to play music. Completely locked down, because the problem with the compact disc was, well, you could rip these things, make them into MP3s, and make perfect copies. Seems really crazy, but the MiniDisc in Japan was a huge success. Everywhere else, it's kind of dead on arrival. It's kind of like Sony bringing a seatbelt to a knife fight. And then, somehow, they made it even worse. Because they figured out, well, the MiniDisc thing's not really happening. CDs are still selling. Let's do something crazy. Sony, which owned BMG Music, started selling CDs with something hidden, and it wasn't a fun track. It was malware, and that's not hyperbole. It was literal malware and rootkits on these compact discs. So when you stuck them in your computer, well, left a little present behind. It was software that secretly hid itself, even when you clicked on no, I don't want to install this. And guess what? It couldn't be easily removed because most people didn't even know that it was on their computer to begin with. I made an entire video about this, but it took some dude, I think, who worked for Microsoft to kind of blow the lid off this whole thing. And the funny thing was that it wasn't on really popular albums. It was on stuff like Neil Diamond and some things that older people would probably be listening to that weren't necessarily all that tech savvy. So one of the theories is that maybe Sony was testing this out to see just how much they could get away with. Anyway, they didn't get away with any of it. But let's go back to the beginning. Close your eyes. Picture E.T. in movie theaters, Blade Runner, and the music format that would have a place of reverence on Rick Deckard's shelf. Before the CD, you don't really realize how annoying everything was before it was created because everything wore out. By the late 1970s, vinyl and cassette tapes were ruling the music world. Vinyl sounded pretty good if you had good equipment. Cassettes? Not really. I mean, you could get a cassette to sound really good if you bought a $4,000 Nakamichi Dragon. But for the most part, most people, the cassette wasn't very good. And the problem with vinyl was every time you played it, well, it degraded just a little bit. Cassettes promised portability, but you got Warble, you got hiss. Half the time you had to wind these back up with a pencil. Portable listening existed, but there was always a compromise. And you can make mixtapes. The problem with making mixtapes was every time you made one, it sounded worse than the thing that you made it from, which sounded pretty bad to begin with. So nobody stood up and said, we need a perfect digital format. But everybody kind of felt that we needed a perfect digital format. And right when analog was wearing out, something shiny showed up. So, Sony and Philips put their head together and they released in 1982 the compact disc. Digital audio. Laser red. Perfect sound that didn't wear out. On paper, it was flawless. However, when you listened to it, it was not flawless. To be fair, this was all new. But there was a standard, 16-bit 44.1, the Red Book standard. So good, in fact, that it's still used today. However, new technology is expensive, and CD players back then were expensive, about $1,000. So what did that mean? It means you really had to hate cassettes to adopt a compact disc, or be rich, or be a tech person. And early reactions were mixed, cold, sterile. But there's one thing that nobody could argue with. You could play that CD 100 times and it still may have sounded cold and sterile, but it didn't sound worse. And once people noticed that, and once CD players got a little bit more affordable, well, that was kind of the last nail in this thing's coffin. By the late 1980s, CDs weren't just winning. I mean, basically, they just took over. They destroyed, fundamentally, the cassette market. The vinyl section in record stores shrank. The cassette section started shrinking too. And record labels saw an opportunity of a lifetime. Because, since this was a new format, they could kind of charge whatever they wanted. They could even re-release old albums in this new format. So people started rebuilding their own music collection, this time on compact disc. And by 1999, global CD shipments were estimated to be over 2 billion units. And remember, Sony and Philips getting paid on everything. The music industry loved it. It was awesome. It was perfect. And that's usually the exact moment when something breaks. And while Rome didn't fall in a day, the demise of the CD was a lot more accelerated. In 1999, US music revenue was estimated to be around $22 billion. Kind of the peak. Now, copying music wasn't new. We all cut our teeth on the mixtape. However, perfect copies was brand new, and you didn't have to wait for a song to be played on the radio to get a perfect copy. MP3s also became a thing, even for non-tech people. And what does that mean? It means CD song, but much smaller, less data. Data. That's important because data can be copied perfectly. And oh yeah, the internet was the thing, and it was a lot easier to share that data over the internet than stick one of these in an envelope and put a bunch of stamps on it and then send it somewhere. And then Napster. Now, Napster didn't invent piracy, but they certainly made it a lot more convenient. You could download a song while you're making toast watching Friends. And for the first time, the music labels couldn't control distribution. Now, cassettes was the first battle that normal people won when it came to music distribution and music control. But the music labels won the war. With one of these and Napster on the World Wide Web, well, the people started winning the war. And when they started winning the war, they asked themselves, why am I buying this? And in 2001, Apple answered the question. Don't buy this anymore because they released the iPod. A whole bunch of songs in your pocket. So it wasn't a format, it was a container for your music. Music stopped being about a format and became storage. There was no skipping, no rewinding, no degradation, just iTunes, Napster, and a whole bunch of other stuff. Also, you could buy one song, so you didn't have to buy the whole record. And even though the mixed tape and the mixed CD existed, while the CD was the final nail in the cassette coffin, iTunes and Napster was the final nail in the CD and album coffin. It was a lot harder to get away with putting a bunch of filler on a record now because you had two singles. And once the album became optional, once physical albums became optional, once buying albums became optional, well, the whole thing collapsed. And to make things much, much worse, in 2007, a little company started out called Spotify. The coffin already nailed shut, but Spotify built a server farm on top of the cemetery. But why? Well, streaming replaced ownership with access. So you didn't have to buy a CD anymore because you could buy a track. Well, now guess what? You didn't have to buy a track anymore. Just get a subscription. By the mid-2010s, CD sales were down 90%. And the media declared CD a dead format. But something else happened during this time. Listening became passive. Skipping became normal. Playlists replaced albums. And playlists, kind of the mixtape, kind of the mixed CD. The problem with playlists, though, is they were a lot easier to make than a mixtape, or even a mixed CD, or even downloading music from iTunes or Napster. I should also mention that Napster got sued into oblivion, but that's a different video. I will link that one at the end. So the CD gave us the ability to skip tracks. Napster gave us the ability to not have to buy CDs. iTunes, even though legit, gave us the ability to just buy one track. Now that you didn't have to buy any of the tracks and just rent your music, well, it became an endless next, next, next. And if you ask people what they listened to yesterday, they probably couldn't tell you. And that's exactly when the second life of the CD begins. Record store day. What does that have to do with CD sales? Well, kind of everything. I think it started in 2007 or 2008. Anyway, record store day was something for independent record stores to get something special and drive business to independent record stores. Well, the thing that Record Store Day proved was that the desire for physical media never really went away. It gave people a reason to show up, something special about buying music, friction, going to buy music, intention to go buy music. Lines formed, and lines aren't convenient, but people did it anyway because it was something cool again. Limited pressings, limited artwork, liner notes, community. And Record Store Day proved one thing. Music and album releases are still powerful enough to make people show up. And while records came first, they had one problem. They weren't cheap. And this was the part that surprised me the most when I was researching this video and a bunch of other videos about the same subject. Gen Z. Hipsters. Now, granted, we expect hipsters to show up at record store day to buy records, but CDs? And recent data shows that Gen Z is buying compact discs in greater numbers than Gen X, than millennials, and boomers. Discogs reports that CD sales are up year over year, and CD manufacturers are reporting 15% growth year over year with compact discs, driven largely by younger customers. Why? Because CDs hit the sweet spot. Cheaper, easier than vinyl, still ownable, still tangible. CD players, a lot less expensive than turntables. And they're not buying CDs as nostalgia. They're buying compact discs as part of their identity. Just like us back in the 90s, what's on their shelf is a representation of who they are. And some artists releasing new albums noticed it, and they leaned all the way in. Taylor Swift, K-pop, yeah, they're driving the CD comeback. Shocking, I know. In 2025, Taylor Swift released The Life of a Showgirl. I obviously did not buy that record. And that one album sold 2 million CDs in the US alone. That wasn't streams, that wasn't bundles, that was just compact discs. Not vinyl with a downloadable code, actual compact discs. And distributors noticed, because while 2 million CDs doesn't sound like a lot when you go back to 1999 in the heyday, 2 million CDs is actually enough to actually affect overall CD sales in 2025 in a statistically significant way. That one release alone impacted sales. And again, that ain't nostalgia, that's young people. And then we gotta talk about K-pop, because they took over the rest of the chart. 5 of the top 10 selling CDs were all K-pop. And here's where it gets cool. Multiple versions, collectibles. Fans weren't buying just music, they were buying objects, belonging, access to limited artwork. And that's even a cooler shift, because now compact discs aren't just about the music. They're about a movement. They're about identity. They're about allegiance. They are about collecting something cool. And oh yeah, you get really good sounding music along with it. So, the CD may not be king anymore when it comes to music, but it did find a new job, serving the people that actually care. Today's video is sponsored by me, Cheap Audio Man merch. You can sign up for the Cam Coffee Club. Fresh coffee delivered to you every month. No need to go to the store. The incredible Cheap Audio Man wallet. It says binge listen on the front. Every time you go to the store to buy dog food, you can be reminded to do what's important. Binge listen. Coffee mugs. RCA cables. Guaranteed to conduct electricity. Link to the store in the description.